Down here's Mexico. First wave of the attack came in disguised as commercial and charter flights, same way they did in Afghanistan in '80. Only they were crack airborne outfits. They took these passes in the Rockies.
So that's what hit Calumet?
I guess so. They coordinated with selective nuke strikes, and the missiles were a hell of a lot more accurate than we thought. They took out the silos here in the Dakotas, key points of communication.
Like what?
Oh, like Omaha, Washington, Kansas City.
Gone?
Yeah,
Jesus Christ.
that's right. Filtrators came up illegal from Mexico. Cubans, mostly. They managed to infiltrate SAC bases in the Midwest, several down in Texas, and wreaked a hell of a lot of havoc, I'm here to tell you. They opened up the door down here. The whole Cuban and Nicaraguan armies come walking right through, roll right up here through the Great Plains.
How far did they get?
Cheyenne, across to Kansas. We held them at the Rockies and at the Mississippi. Anyway, the Russians reinforced with 60 divisions. Sent 3 whole army groups across the Bering Strait into Alaska, cut the pipeline, came across Canada, to link up here in the middle, but we stopped their butt cold. Lines have pretty much stabilized now.
What about Europe?
I guess they figured twice in 1 century was enough. They're sitting this one out. All except England. They won't last very long. The Russians need to take us in one piece, and that's why they're here now. That's why they won't use nukes anymore, and we won't either, not on our own soil. The whole damn thing's pretty conventional now. Who knows, maybe next week will be swords.
What started it?
I don't know, 2 toughest kids on the block, I guess. Sooner or later, they're gonna fight.
That's simple.
Maybe somebody just forgot what it was like.
Well, who is on our side?
600 million screaming Chinamen.
Well, last I heard, there were 1 billion screaming Chinamen.
There were.
All right, that was a scene from my favorite Cold War era film, one of my favorite Cold War era films, Red Dawn. And that's Powers Booth explaining to Charlie Sheen and the late Patrick Swayze how World War III started. Before we bring on our guest today, I need to introduce my co-host, my homie, my dog, Pascal Robert.
Brother Jason Miles, how you living? We got this. This is a light blue shirt thing going on here.
I do. I have a button-up shirt on because you always wear a button-up shirt, so I am going to wear a button-up shirt. Our guest today is dressed up. So let's bring on our guest today. He is a PhD in political science. Pascal goes, let's do a show on Russia. And he says it very flippantly like that. And then I go, okay, well, who do I know that might know someone that has a background in Russian history? So I asked friend of show, the latest podcast episode up right now, Jean Bajlan, Dr. Jean Bajlan. And Jean goes, oh, my friend Kuba, no problem. Connects us. So far, it's been a very wonderful texting and now talking friendship. So let me bring on PhD in political science, Kuba Wrzensniewski.
Hello, Jason.
I tried.
Hello, Pascal.
I was saying it the whole time we were off it. I was like, I'm gonna get it. So, do you remember that film? Are you old enough to remember that film?
Oh, absolutely. Everything, I grew up in Canada, so everything got a little watered down in terms of the Cold War tension.
Mm-hmm.
But my sister and my mom both shared a crush on Patrick Swayze, so couldn't go wrong with Red Dawn.
So you had to do
They
the
just
Red Dawn, Dirty Dancing back to back.
double feature, right? The Swayze night, and so the politics from my family is Polish. We came over in 1983 to Canada,
Mm-hmm.
so we understood the Eastern Bloc from the inside,
Mm-hmm.
and everything about Red Dawn was absolutely fanciful. If you actually knew what the Eastern Bloc looked like, the idea that you'd actually have that kind of an aggressive move, and also that the United States would be caught flat-footed. Like it all came across as real fantasy, but
Well, what's really
Patrick
funny is like
Swayze.
no one knows this is happening. Like he has to explain them how the war is going on. Like I get this was 84 when this movie was supposed to take place, but TV still definitely existed. Maybe we weren't connected through phones and the internet like we are now, but I definitely watched the news and I definitely knew what was going on. I just find it hilarious that they're just sitting there like, and then what happened with the Chinese people? Tell us more, Powers Booth.
Well, it does really capture something about the and this is something that I only learned much later when I started spending some time in the United States. I moved down for college and then I stuck around for 10, 15 years. Once you get out of the big cosmopolitan urban centers, and once you get away from immigrant or refugee or migrant families, people who have international connections personally, the level of disinterest in international affairs is so great that it's actually kind of plausible that Powers Booth would need to. So there's this thing called the Cold War. You remember Ivan Drago? There's a country of Ivan Dragos, and they don't like us. And it's more than boxing, it turns out. So, now we have to deal with that. And the Cubans, they're like a bad kind of Mexican. They're helping the Ivan Dragos.
No.
So yeah, now we've got a problem.
Now, what's fascinating, right, is that you're doing this intentionally in a very comical, kind of satirical way. But I want to ask you, as someone who is a child of immigrants from Canada, understanding international affairs, do you think that antipathy to global politics amongst ranking file members of society is an American phenomenon?
So it's definitely much more intense in the United States than elsewhere. Generally speaking, most people live lives that are very local, grounded in their communities, their families. There's this very famous statistic that half of Americans don't have passports. It's much more than that, but I don't want to overshoot. While Europeans, for instance, everybody seems to have a passport in the EU. And the truth is, if your country is the size of Luxembourg or Belgium, and you've got a neighbor that you want to visit who requires international travel, you're going to have more exposure to foreign countries and to the international environment. Similarly, if you're the United States, international affairs is something that your government does to other people, while for many countries in the global south, international relations is something that foreigners do to you, especially the United States, which forces you to learn a little, to understand a little, to have some of your consciousness occupied by international affairs, like it or not. While in the United States, you have the luxury of sort of being able to opt out of thinking about international affairs if you don't want to watch the news, if it's not something that that you care a great deal about, and you also don't need to travel anywhere.
Right.
You can safely live your life in a 4 or 5 state radius and visit all kinds of places and have a very sort of fulfilling personal experience, never learn another language. Foreign countries are far away, and to the extent that you see them in the most accessible forms of popular culture, they're kind of scary, and they require learning another language and a plane flight and vaccinations maybe and getting a passport. So it's much easier to drift into this kind of ignorance, this global ignorance as an American than it is if you're living in a densely populated region with many countries cheek by jowl, like in the EU or in East Asia, or if you're constantly dealing with tourists, foreign businessmen, and the pressures of the international community on every aspect of your nation's policy, like many other countries, or anywhere in the Middle East for that matter, where the news is something that gets filmed on location where you live rather than something that you watch.
Cuba, let me ask you a question. Do you think that those that dictate American foreign and international policy are aware of that aspect of the American populace and use it in their advantage in creating domestic consensus for foreign policy?
So, and I've spent the last 3 years working in, I like to describe my position as a very small cog in the military industrial complex in Washington, D.C. And I met all kinds of D.C. policy types, from progressive, liberal, civilians, Democratic Party activist type people, to military officers, command level officers, professional bureaucrats, policy think tank people. And the Americans who staff the national security apparatus and the foreign policy apparatus, whether as academics, specialists, as officials, as policymakers, as elected officials, they are apart from the regular American population. By and large, most of them come from backgrounds that are already fairly narrow in terms of their contact with working class Americans, certainly, but even less cosmopolitan Americans, the kind of local country club types that stay in their hometowns and run the local sawmill or control a regional economy or local government. Those figures are not represented very well in Washington at all. And the foreign policy especially is made in this elite community with a relatively free hand and no real sense that it needs to be justified or explained to the American public, except through the national myths that constitute the essence of the American, self-identity, self-image, that we're the good guys, we do the right thing, we're a force for good in the world, our military, are, we're heroes, this kind of thing. And those ideas, in a kind of cognitive, in a very visible cognitive dissonance, go side by side with fairly ruthless international policy, which often kind of has very amorphous goals beyond the maintenance of American prestige and position internationally. And as a result, that ignorance, that large-scale ignorance is already baked in. It's not something that you need to cultivate. It's not something that you need to consciously take advantage of. It's in the structure already.
Fascinating. Jason, you have any questions?
Sorry, I was doing my other job, which is running this show. We were talking a little bit back and forth offline, and Pascal had asked an interesting question about Russiagate, which kind of dominated the political discourse, the mainstream media side, right? We're the left world of media on this show, so I'm sure most people here didn't really fall victim to it, but you had gave us a pretty funny answer. I thought when we asked you about it. What was your question exactly, Pasquale?
I generally asked him. I said, what is his perception? I think I asked him whether or not he believed that the Russiagate narrative had any viability, viability at all, even to the ones who are conveying it. In other words, I mean, I'm even more cynical than many on the left, is that I actually fundamentally believe that the people at the higher echelons who were pushing Russiagate knew it was a crock of shit from the top. I don't think that you can be serious about American international espionage and be so absolutely absurd enough to believe that the idea that WikiLeaks leaking actual true emails, even if the Russians allowed that to happen, sabotage the election. And the thing that's funny about Russiagate, right, is that people don't even understand what they say by the conspiracy.
Yeah.
What the actual conspiracy is supposed to be is that Putin and the Russians helped or gave digital access to Julian Assange to access legitimate, accurate emails that were released to the public that helped shape the election. And my whole position is that how different is this than Daniel Ellsberg? Like, even if we believe the Russians helped do this, like, this is totally within the whistleblowing history of American journalism. It's not as if these were contrived, manufactured emails. These were actual, true, legitimate emails, which the veracity was never challenged. So my whole position is that, well, not that I believe this, but even if you believe the narrative, how is this a conspiracy?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what's the gotcha here?
Yeah, it's because they my take on Russiagate, and one of my Berkeley classmates is actually I won't mention their name, but they're
Russiagator.
They were just a standard issue sort of left liberal at Berkeley, but they became a significant neocon Putin hater in Washington, D.C. Very active in mobilizing sort of NATO opposition to quote unquote Russian aggression. And there's that quote, I can't remember, I think it was Mencken, that you'll have a lot of trouble convincing a man of something that his livelihood requires him not to believe, right? And the cynics in Washington are very, very few, but cognitive dissonance is everywhere. People do not think of themselves as I'm manipulating, I'm dissembling, I'm lying, but they will simultaneously have the beliefs that allow them to maintain the American exceptionalism, virtue, that they're personally doing the right thing, together with this is good for my career, this is what makes sense for the donors of my think tank or my bosses on the political side, and somehow fit those two imperatives together. And when you have a country as large as the United States, you just have enough personnel, enough cadres, so that anybody who can't live with the cognitive dissonance just gets washed out. A little like me, right? I am no longer a defense contractor in Washington, D.C., and although I can't prove it, I think that my political views, which Bernie Sanders mainstreamed, I wouldn't say that I'm any further beyond the pale than the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. But I know for a fact that, or rather I suspect strongly that one reason why I'm no longer working on these contracts is because eventually the political discomfort of having somebody that far left inside the room was too much of a challenge for my employers. And there's more to that because I'm also an immigrant. I'm also not a U.S. citizen. There's issues of clearances. There's that kind of thing. But altogether, you don't fit the right mold. You can't hold the right ideas simultaneously. You're a little too aware that this doesn't make sense.
That's a real thing.
You get selected out or you leave. This happens especially in the military, actually, which has an upper outs personnel model in terms of who becomes general officers, who enters command. So you're never going to retain all of your talent. And people who come in and don't like what they see, they become critical of American defense policy. And there's a lot to criticize, even if you're strict nationalist. If you believe the content, if you accept the premises of things like the National Defense Strategy, then you have to wonder, why are we so bad at it? Why are we constantly doing things that fail to achieve the objectives that we say we have and incur incredible costs to the United States? So those people, they don't make it. But those who can simultaneously hold the beliefs that make the system run ideologically and execute on the policies that organizationally they're incentivized to, from the perspective of career, from the perspective of donors, from the perspective of the people they're accountable to professionally, then, if you can't juggle those two contradictory perspectives, then you end up leaving. And the people who are there all reinforce one another as well. Anybody who starts doubting a little, at the Woodrow Wilson Institute or at the State Department, well, they have rooms full of friends and colleagues who are there to shore up the things that they need to think.
The ideological consensus, in other words, has a mechanism that almost flows naturally within the mechanisms of these institutions.
Exactly. There's a strong level of enforcement of groupthink or intellectual conformity that allows you not to confront the disconnect between what you say you're doing and what you're actually doing.
What's fascinating is this totally works with C. Wright Mills' book, The Power Elite, and how the people who shape these type of policies all come from certain key institutions, and they have a certain ideological worldview that starts, if not in their preparatory school years, maybe even earlier than college, that just simply trickles upwards into these institutions. And what's becoming more fascinating with this period of time is how the oppressive force of those mechanisms are getting stronger, but they're also becoming more racially diverse in terms of management.
Yes, and there's a very interesting, and I did my undergraduate education. I came to the United States originally because I was accepted at Harvard, and I overlapped but did not meet Pete Buttigieg, Mark Zuckerberg, and Natalie Portman. And that was also extremely instructional because you could see this new multicultural, inclusive elite being generated, where simultaneously the worst personal defects are forms of bigotry, whether sexism or racism or homophobia, but you're also being molded into this exclusive meritocratic elite, which perceives its role as creating policy for everybody else and having a rightful place at the top and a rightful claim to the lion's share of social and economic resources, because you're just better. You're better because Harvard accepted you, and you're a good person because look at your friends. There's people from all around the world and people from every background. You're constantly talking about marginal groups and what you can do for Latinos, African Americans. You've all been to a gay wedding, so you're clearly the good guys. And Putin is clearly the bad guy. Trump is clearly the bad guy. And you don't take into account the fact that the substance of your privilege, the substance of your elite position, stems from these exclusionary and exploitative structures.
Yeah, so you get to feel happy while you have a multicultural table basically driving the Death Star.
Exactly. We have our first female CIA torturer. What are you guys complaining about?
Exactly.
We finally have a
Darth
Latino
Vader
running the
and
DHS
drag.
prisons.
Darth Vader and drag. Feel happy.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, you wouldn't believe.
There you go.
It gets crazy when they put on the drag show every Christmas at the Death Star.
That's what equality looks like.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. That's what equality looks like.
What equality looks like? Well, we didn't have you on here to talk about the folly of
the ruling class.
The ruling class and racial politics.
But it's also spicy. It is spicy though.
No, I'm fucking with it. It's actually really funny. We Darth Vader and drag, somebody said. One thing we wanted to talk to you about, definitely Pascal, the whole thing why I came to him, again, Jason, find someone that knows about Russia.
The conversation is fascinating because frankly, you have a fascinating resume and background. Okay?
Yes.
It's not going to be often that two guys like myself and Jason, who are some would call hardcore leftists, are going to be able to interview, an open out, State Department asset, military industrial complex employee with left politics who was willing to talk on the record about.
There's three of me, right? First of all, this particular configuration doesn't happen. I didn't meet anybody with politics similar to mine. That's not true. There's one guy, and he's cool. But
that must have made for some horrible lunches.
as I grew up in interior British Columbia, Canada, and
Speaking of horrible lunch,
depending on the way that you cut it, I was always the only one of me at every stage of my life. Like growing up, I was the only Eastern European immigrant. Then when I came to Harvard, I was the only person from interior British Columbia. Then when I left, I would be the only, you name it. And so you accept the fact that you're the weird one and that you're an immigrant, you're an outsider in a different milieu. They're the locals. It's their system. So you need to adjust, right? And respect. And that's a habit you learn as an immigrant. And it's, if you have a agreeable personality type, if you like to be liked, then it also can be very helpful in life because it gives you the space to not immediately get into conflict with people and instead hear somebody out who's from a completely different world, has a completely different set of sort of values or foundational beliefs. So yeah, lunch was weird, but it was good for multiculturalism, you know, really trained the tolerance instinct and got to learn a lot about it, a lot of different types of people.
Well, to be fair to our audience and to be on with Jason's trying to keep me in line here. We're going to try to keep it in line with the subject matter.
I can't. I know.
I'm sorry.
My mom says you have a great radio voice.
Question I start.
My mom said you had a great radio voice.
I can assure you, we're going to try to have you on again to talk about a multiple of
me with a good time.
Are you from? You're from Kelowna. I can't say it.
Kelowna, British Columbia.
Yes.
But I want you to start us with our long inquiry into this new Cold War between Russia and the United States and its various ramifications. I'm going to ask you a question I asked you in the chat that I think is the best way to start. Can you explain to our audience who are not aware of the recent history of relationships between the former Soviet Union and the United States, how Vladimir Putin is actually a creation of America's policy towards Russia in the post-Soviet era?
So, and this is, I think that there's a real generational aspect to understanding the trajectory of Russia, because we've gotten so far away from the moment of kind of like maximum American unipolarity and global leadership in the wake of the Cold War. The 90s were really the epitome of American unilateralism, but also the high watermark for the legitimacy of American unilateralism. That it can be difficult to imagine what it felt like as the Soviet Union fell apart. It was the bad guy in movies, right? It was the existential threat to not just the United States, but the Western world, South Korea, Japan. You didn't have to be a sort of like white capitalist country to have a lot of anxiety, you know, to fear to see the Soviet Union as a global enemy. And these guys who are absolutely terrifying, have largest military in the world, nuclear weapons, everything. They just give it up. The system collapses from the inside. No war, no shots fired. It's a people power revolution, and one Soviet bloc country after another, the communist parties are swept from power, and these former enemies look to the West for help in restructuring their societies, restructuring their politics and their economies, and in the hopes of securing something like the quality of life and the individual freedoms that were enjoyed by Westerners. And there's a sincerity in that term. There's bracing honesty in the 90s, early 90s Russian attempt to grapple with what it meant to admit that the Soviet Union had failed, and that failure had such catastrophic human consequences.
You don't think Afghanistan had something to do with that failure?
I was going to ask
did.
that too. I was going to ask that too about what you thought
Mhm.
about Afghanistan and, you know, also American exceptionalism, Rambo 3.
The Vietnam, it was the Vietnam of the Soviet Union.
Working
Absolutely. But the United States, after Vietnam came Reagan, and in the Soviet Union, one thing that I grapple with is the equivalency that's drawn between the United States and the Soviet Union in the Cold War. The reality was that the Soviet Union was never a peer to the United States. They had started, in terms of pre-revolutionary Russian Empire, in a much weaker, much more precarious, much more tenuous position, economically, technologically.
It didn't have the same primitive accumulation as the United States.
Yes, America got to expropriate and got to build up with an immigrant population that was sorted for skills, all kinds of access to Western financial and technological resources, all kinds of advantages. It was a greenfield project, whereas the Soviet Union had all of these legacies of the Russian Empire, and started from a much, it was 200 years behind in 1918, and then it had to fight World War II. So the Soviet Union, to try to keep up with the United States in the Cold War, had burned through most of its economic potential, and the system was economically exhausted by the 1980s. It didn't know how to generate that kind of material comfort, which while simultaneously claiming to be a peer or even a superior to the United States in every aspect. And the level of repression that was necessary to keep the system going, through the Stalinist 5-year plans, through the brutal primitive accumulation, and just the expropriation of labor to translate into industry, to turn it into industrial capital. That experience had traumatized and brutalized the population, and it was unsustainable. So you had you had all of these costs that were all mounting throughout the post-war period, and in the 80s, with the breakdown of the economic order, to add like everyday misery on top of the experience of political repression, constant propaganda, a lack of individual agency that affected people's lives, that Afghanistan was just icing on the cake. So the system breaks, and the Soviets go from challenging the American framework for understanding international affairs to accepting it. That, we were the bad guys. We weren't doing the right thing. Now tell us, Yankee, like how do we build a country like yours? The material condition in Russia after the end of communism was also dire. Without the political aspects of the system keeping the command economy going, the production chains, all of the economic institutions of the Soviet Union broke down, and you ended up with fragmented, unproductive industry trying to just keep the lights on for the country. The independence of different republics, places like Ukraine, places like Kazakhstan, the Baltic states, you lost some of your productive base that had been previously part of the same national economy, not to mention all of the satellite states like Poland or Eastern Europe. And you were now playing in an international economy that was dominated by the West. So there was a need for material aid as well, some economic relief. And that had to come from the West because now that was the only game in town. The Russians under Boris Yeltsin invite American experts, Western experts, into Moscow, into close collaboration with the Russian government. Jeffrey Sachs is probably the most famous one, but there were a lot of others. And they introduce mechanisms to try to convert the command economy into a private market-driven economy.
Neoliberalism.
Neoliberalism, exact. Shock therapy, privatization, marketization, liberalization. And these measures undertaken at the same time as a general cultural crisis that comes with the end of the communist culture and the communist system and the communist order, create a humanitarian catastrophe. The healthcare system in the Soviet Union was sophisticated. It delivered outcomes on par with the First World. The educational system was likewise very strong, especially in technical fields. But all of the funding and resourcing that vanished along with the command economy. The new market economy that had until very recently been the black market. It had been criminal enterprises by definition. So the advantage, the people who were the first movers were often criminal syndicates themselves or cynical operators that were willing to work together or copy some of the tactics of criminal enterprises. And the breakdown of norms led to, especially in the context of the example of the West being like sex, drugs, and rock and roll, not a criticism, but it turns out that if that's the course you take under conditions of cultural and economic catastrophe, you're going to end up with a lot of serious addiction problems, HIV, AIDS, and other crises that end up driving down the life expectancy for Russians. Alcoholism and suicide and violence become endemic, especially for men. Life becomes extraordinarily grim. While at the same time, you're being told that this is democracy, this is freedom, just around the corner, we're going to turn into the West. Just around the corner, there's going to be great things coming. The economic reforms end up being captured with some, I think Jeff Sachs was dumb and naive, but there were other Western economists and specialists that came in order to reform the country that were cynical and knew what they were doing. And they generated schemes for privatization, which could very easily be gamed by insiders to capture the most productive assets of the economy. So you end up with an economic system, a distribution of economic gains that's based entirely on expropriation, expropriation of individuals of public goods. This is where you get the rise of the oligarchs, billionaire Russian, businessmen that command entire sectors of the Russian economy. People like Mikhail Khodorkovsky or Roman Abramovich. They are Jeff Bezos rich, but without even building Amazon. They just take over Norilsk Nickel, for instance, or the Lukoil or other profitable, mostly natural resource based enterprises. They treat the Russian state as, as oligarchs do, as essentially a executive committee staff for their economic empires. These bureaucrats are here to make sure that my interests are taken care of. I can buy and sell the Duma 7 times over. And the late Yeltsin period is people very quickly wise up to the fact that this is a disaster for us. And that would be bad enough domestically. And there was a very strong narrative that it was, the Russians had gotten it wrong. It's their own fault. They're too corrupt. They're too anti-capitalist. There's a bad Slavic mentality that has prevented them from being like the Czechs or the Poles, where you have a much more successful transition to a kind of European style economic and political order. But when Russians looked at the international dimension of what was going on, they had sought an international order which would be based on multilateralism. That with the end of the Cold War, there was no need for NATO, there was no need for the Warsaw Pact. We're all in it together.
There was no need for
the UN Security Council,
the NATO to invade Russian territories.
Exactly. Like if we're not the Soviet Union anymore, if we're not threatening you guys, we have no Warsaw Pact. Why do you guys still have NATO? Right? If NATO is supposed to defend against this threat doesn't exist. Why is NATO not only still existing, but why is it moving closer and closer to us? And if we're all friends now, and there's an international community, and it's all peace and love and democracy, then why aren't you running your security policy through the UN Security Council? That's what it was established for. We have the documents. You guys built it with us in the post World War II settlement, and now it can run like it was supposed to because we no longer have this ideological tension. We're seeing eye to eye. So why aren't we handling Yugoslavia through the UN? Why are you handling it through NATO and just telling us what you're going to do? Do we not get a vote anymore on things that happen thousands of miles away from you, but in our own backyard? And the dismemberment of Serbia was for many politically oriented Russians the giveaway, the mask off moment, when it became clear that the Americans were not your friends, that there was not going to be a partnership between a post-communist Russia and the United States, but that they were being taken for a ride. And they had been shorn like sheep economically by oligarchs and Western experts. And now they were being neglected and abused politically through an international order that was essentially Washington consensus forever and American unilateralism, with Russia just having to accept whatever outcomes they were given. The expansion of NATO to include the Baltic states was likewise a real eye-opening moment where, if we're going with Star Wars, like, I have altered the deal, pray I don't alter it further.
One of my favorite lines from Empire. There are some
Yeah.
questions that I definitely want to get into. Now they're so far up. I gotta find them. Did political repression by the Communist Party contribute to the neoliberal consensus of the opposition by removing them from a working class base?
Interesting question. I think that there was a communist resurgence in the 1996 election. I think it was in the when Boris Yeltsin was running for his second term, and Gennady Zyuganov, at the head of a revamped Communist Party, looked like he might be able to replace him, with the sort of number 2 and 3 spots occupied not by Yeltsin but by I think Vladimir Zhirinovsky was polling relatively well early on. He was a crazy nationalist figure. It looked like the neoliberal experiment might have run its course in Russia, and a new chapter would start. There were all of these Communist Party institutions connecting the party with the working class in all across the former Soviet Union, and these institutions had legitimacy problems because they were associated with, like the question said, political repression, propaganda too. They weren't necessarily seen as trustworthy, but they were there while other political parties were still nascent. I think that the power of cognitive capture can't be overstated, especially when one side of the ideological confrontation has control to the commanding heights of not just the national Russian mediascape, but the international consensus among experts and foreign policy types, multilateralists. So it felt, if you had any kind of sophistication in the 90s and any sort of establishment, if you weren't kind of in the wilderness in terms of your political orientation, you were trying to be a grown-up and sort of play within the structures that existed and, real existing political affairs, the neoliberalism was absolutely hegemonic. It was a Margaret Thatcher, there is no alternative situation, where no option, you could, in American elections, like between George W. Bush and Bill Clinton, you could pick between two different flavors of neoliberal. And this happened all over the world. Every oppositional tendency just collapsed. It really looked like history had objectively vindicated capitalist modernity of the American stripe. So the opposition,
the end of history, as Fukuyama would say.
Precisely.
Right?
Precisely. That was taught at every university, and it wasn't laughed out of class. So every Russian who didn't feel like an obscurantinist, who wasn't willing to stand athwart history yelling stop, knew that there had to be some kind of accommodation with neoliberalism. And the criticism of Yeltsin was that he was too corrupt, not that he had the wrong ideology. If you offered the Russian people a successful neoliberalism, the promise of the successful neoliberalism, that had a certain appeal.
Jason, I wanted Jason to take a note of that. Think about what Kuba is saying here, that neoliberalism had reached such a consensus that the thought of an option was non-existent in the world. This is during the Clinton era.
Well, I mean, from my understanding, the book Hypernormalization is from a Russian author. It's more about the fall of the Soviet Union, but still that understanding that everything that you know is coming to an end, but there's nothing you can do about it. So you just kind of deal with it, if you will.
And there's a long legacy of that kind of fatalism in the experience of people under Soviet communism, right? The idea of agency, either individual or collective, against this system that you're operating in just seems fanciful and far-fetched.
I think Pascal is. Are you saying that like that's kind of where we are here in the States? Because
no, I'm just saying.
I feel like it.
No, this might be. I don't know. Maybe I'm being naive, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm actually brightly optimistic as someone who's lived through this period of what I call the Great Counter-Revolution, the 50-year Counter-Revolution since the 60s to today, that we have a whole cadre of people who are like, neoliberalism is evil. Like, this is like horrible. Like, there's something like, I mean, oh my gosh, people are saying capitalism is a problem. Like, I think as much as we realize the faults that the left has, and I'm always one saying that there is no left, but I don't think we understand that, like, no one was having these kind of conversations 25, 30 years ago. No one
Not
was,
even close.
no
Absolutely.
one was debating neoliberalism or the efficacy of capitalism at all.
Absolutely. I mean, you'd have to be a tanky, straight up, unreformed neo-Stalinist to be on the outside of, to quibble with Davos, right? That's when all of these institutions acquired the sheen and luster that they have now, because the collapse of the Soviet Union really made it look like they knew what they were doing, and that was going to be. My instincts had always been to be suspicious of the wealth power, and in college I was already a socialist, but I felt like it was only a matter of time before I'd have to give it up, because McDonald's was everywhere. The Starbucks was taking over. Bill Gates was the world's richest man. It was going to be it was going to be
Monopoly everywhere you look. Yeah,
exactly. And it was going to work. And that was the worst part of it, right? Like, it was going to be this, if you, in the movie Starship Troopers, that was chilling for me. And not because of the military dictatorship or the brain bug, but because the vision that they had of the future was just American suburbia, but everywhere. And you had these consumer kids playing neo football or whatever, and talking like Californian kids, and going to the mall in a very consumeristic 1990s American type of way. And you realize that that's Buenos Aires, because now every city is Los Angeles. That's all that there's going to be. And for a lot of people, you ask somebody in a favela in Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, you could be a middle class person in Los Angeles. They'll take that. They'll take that in a heartbeat. Of course, that's when there were middle class people in Los Angeles, but that felt incredibly depressing. That my side was going to lose. I had these lingering suspicions, but I guess it's just my bad Slavic mind, right? I needed to get with the program and, go work for Goldman Sachs, because the finance guys were running the world. Corporations were going to save us all, and Davos forever.
Did you read Anand Giridharadas' Winner Take All, or do you follow him at all?
Oh, he specializes in like the billionaire class.
Yeah.
He's on CNN a lot.
Yeah.
MSNBC.
Yes.
too.
MSNBC. Oh, I think
Yes.
he's got a show with them or something. Or
Yeah, and
he
that's
speaks to that. He speaks to what you're talking about. He speaks to actually quite a bit in his book because it's a he follows a young woman that wants to change the world, and she realizes that she's not going to change the world through anything in electoral politics, and she was going to change the world through working for either she goes to Goldman Sachs or McKinsey, one of the two. I can't remember.
Yeah.
And that's and she's going to make enough money there, and then she's going to start her foundation, and that's how she's going to change the world. And he juxtaposes this young girl coming out of school at the end of the book to Bill Clinton, and he was with Bill Clinton for I think like 3 or 4 months, and Bill Clinton is going to change the world through electoral politics.
And incidentally, Goldman Sachs and McKinsey, that's the number 1 and number 2 employers of my class graduating at Harvard. That's where the talent went, right? Like, why waste your time going, becoming a doctor or going into electoral politics when you could be where the real action is in the private sector, in finance, or
in the tech world. It definitely goes into dealing with these young tech gajillionaires and them wanting to save and change the world on a whim. But it's funny that you talk about the Davos world, because he definitely is extremely critical of the Davos world. I don't know how effective he really is, because he actually is kind of, when you're getting paid to speak at Google and you're critiquing Google, how seriously do they take you? I don't know.
Well, the interesting thing is that perspective has gone from being completely hegemonic in the 1990s to the point where it was laughable if you were outside of it. The best that you could hope for was like a Gerhard Schroeder type social democratic organized retreat, but everybody knew that the corporations, that finance ruled the world, and if the bond market didn't like it, then you didn't get to have a healthcare system. And the Washington Consensus was going to structurally adjust everybody into neoliberalism anyway, so you needed to just get with the program. That was completely dominant in the 90s, and now it's obvious that it's failed. You've got some dead enders, and you've got some people who are inside the power structures that are still very influential. But even individual business figures in the business world, even some finance people are like, we need a new deal or something, because this model has reached exhaustion.
Oh yeah, well that's why you have in online Derridas is that he will challenge capital except capitalism. Saying he'll challenge the lords of capital, but he will not challenge capitalism. In other words, he'll come close enough to say, yeah, the billionaires, they're the problem, but he's not going to say, well, capitalism is actually the problem, because then he won't be on Morning Joe, because Morning Joe doesn't want to have people on his show talking about, well, Joe, capitalism is the root of the problem here.
Yeah.
Because then he's like, no, this is a capitalist country in America. And, Morning Joe is not going to have a conversation about primitive accumulation or the fact that, reserve labor of army, or, the racialization of the reserve labor of army, planned obsolescence. He's not going to talk about any of that stuff,
And this is one problem that I think is very limiting in the United States. It's a particular American pathology, which is treating capitalism as a single variable, as like an on-off, a 1 or 0.
Because so capitalist realism.
Yeah, yes, that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is the end of capitalism.
Yeah,
and there's Marxist theory does have this very clear break between this is capitalism, this is socialism. But I think what we've seen in Europe, and not just European countries, that there's such a thing as capitalism with a human face. You have these social democratic systems which are better. They're much better. They work a lot better. They're much more humane. You get your health care. Social mobility is better, and they don't require a revolutionary road to the re-engineering of society. I'm not saying that that's
mean,
the
the thing-
best that we could hope for, but
The larger thing for me is that no one will admit that all of these things are social constructs. Right? This is not physics. This is not earth science. These things are ideas that people put monetary resources by to propagate, to force them into reality. There's no, I mean, listen, there are basic realities that allow the infrastructure of American capitalism to seem dominant. One of
Yes.
them is that there were
And to seem
primitive
inevitable.
accumulative values that allow the system to excel in a certain way. It doesn't hurt that after World War II, you have almost complete market share control over foreign exchange and trade as well. The larger point I'm trying to convey is that the ideological infrastructure in terms of media, thought, school, education, how we view ourselves, where we place our value, these things would have to be fundamentally reevaluated, and can be if we put the energy and the mechanisms into doing that than making commercials for Burger King. You see, but the thing is, though, you would have to have a complete revolution of the psyche and value system of Western society that would not be placed primarily on profit and exploitation and extraction, and actually the community well-being for that to begin to happen.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. I think that we're not as that, especially with the breakdown of neoliberal intellectual hegemony, that you can see parts of the West that aren't necessarily captured by that value system or that world perspective. And it's not just the left either. There's Christian democratic parties in Europe, traditional Catholics, other groups that come from a very different place that are also questioning the benefit of marketizing everything in society, of turning every relationship into a transaction. And what comes out of this process is uncertain. There's significant forces of reaction. There's a lot of powerful interests that benefit from everything being a transaction, of everything being up for sale. And of those that have alternative visions, some of them are white ethno-states. Some of them are theocrats. Some of them are problematic, to put it mildly. And I think we're living through that adjustment. And, the empire can still win. Everything can fall apart. We're off book. We elected Donald Trump, so anything is possible.
Did you?
Which is, incidentally, to bring it back, where Russia was in the 1990s. And once it had dawned on people that they weren't going to get invited into the West, they weren't going to be tutored into becoming another United States.
Before you ask your question, Pascal, I do have to. There's quite a few questions, and I feel really bad we haven't got. I don't know if we can get to all of them because there's quite a few. This one's well, I guess let me ask this one first. I would like to hear more about Russian attitudes about the I guess we can ask both these, like an A and B. I'd like to hear more about the Russian attitudes about the communist past, and has the idea of communism been repressed or dismissed in the Russian psyche?
Well, for Russians, the idea of communism is tied to the specifics of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union is for Russians more than just a communist system. It's the heroic struggle against the Third Reich. It's where my parents grew up. It's a specific time and place with a culture, with a spirit. It's a home. And feelings get extremely complex about the Soviet Union. There's nostalgia, there's pride, there's also an awareness that millions of people were repressed. There was a tremendous amount of politically imposed suffering, and that the end of it was so ignominious and so devastating. And the fact that there were so many Russian, Soviet era political leaders that had lied about things like Chernobyl, that had lied about great disasters, that had blundered into Afghanistan, that had created these catastrophes for the Russian people. So the feeling of the Soviet Union and the attitude towards communism is fraught. It's very complex. It's linked to a lot of trauma, and reactions will vary based on the individual. Some people just want to forget about it, just draw a thick line behind it. Putin, the official narrative is to try to rework the Soviet Union into a grander Russian national trajectory, a national progression from the early Slavs and the Kievan Rus through to the Russian Empire, Soviet Union, and now Putin's Russia, with the rehabilitation of figures like Lenin and even Stalin as great men, as basically czars that ushered Russia into a new age. And but there's no, because the feelings aren't one-sided, nobody wants to really just go back, turn the clock back and do that all over again. It feels like it's over.
Gotcha. Is Radio Free Europe / Radio Liberty still CIA op? You know anything about that, Pascal?
I mean, I know a lot of people on the left who always believe that Western radio in the Eastern Bloc is a CIA front. I mean, that's just kind of like normal left conspiracy theory chatter kind of stuff. I mean, I don't have the answers to that. I mean, that's the equivalent question that is too for the liberals is RT coming out of SB. What is the current version of the Kremlin, the Russian Secret Service?
Russia Today, Sputnik,
Sputnik,
FSB,
FSB. Yeah, I mean, not to make a false equivalency, but I'm saying is that I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, listen, do you think? I mean, would it shock you that the United States or the State Department would be interested in exporting American propaganda to what they consider to be hostile territory? It wouldn't be shocking at all. I mean, it's not like it hasn't been done before. If you're asking me, do I think it's possible? Yeah, I think it's possible. Do I have a definitive answer? I don't have a definitive answer, but I think it's very possible. It's not impossible.
What he's trying to say is you might see us on RT if the money's right.
So if the rubles spend.
If the rubles flow, I will go.
I don't think I would. I'll be very honest with you. I watch RT, I watch Sputnik. I have friends who appear on Sputnik, and I like their shows. And what would stop me from going on RT and Sputnik is not that I have a problem with Russians having media in the United States. It's that I wouldn't want people to be able to say, well, they're financed by the Russians, that's why you can't listen to them. I don't want that to be an obstacle to people being able to listen to my content. It's not, and I don't do, I mean, I watch those sources. I listen to those sources. But at the same time, I understand in this political environment how that allows your content to be categorized, and people can create obfuscation to deny you an audience. And I wouldn't want to allow myself to be in that trap.
Well, look, I got banned twice in 10 days from Facebook. And the second time they banned me, my post was, hey, anybody seen that Night Stalker documentary? That was the last post I had.
Yeah, I think this touches on a very important development that comes out of the post-Cold War period, which is the turning news and turning media into a political front. One of the lessons that Putin learned a bunch of lessons from the collapse of the Soviet Union and the 1990s era. And they largely stemmed from the fact that you can defeat an empire through entirely cognitive, cultural means. You don't have to shoot. If you can control discourse, if you can get hegemony for your worldview, be it neoliberalism, be it something else, then the people will stop listening to their leaders, and you could have a color revolution. You could have the collapse of the Soviet Union. So how do you prevent that from happening? Well, you need to have your own channels for information that are just as polished and that have thread the same line of pushing a particular ideological perspective, but also having enough journalistic legitimacy so people can't dismiss them immediately. And that's, and you know, there's Radio Free Europe. That was one example. And Radio Free Europe benefited tremendously from the fact that on the other side, the Soviet bloc journalism was so transparently politicized and fabricated. If you were more honest than that, then you could really present a convincing ideological case while seeming to just report the facts. And Russia today is a response. It's been built to be that. And Al Jazeera has been built to be that from a Middle Eastern perspective and for a Middle Eastern audience. The BBC, any country with any pretensions to a geopolitical position right now needs to have its own media apparatus and its own narrative that can prevent the kind of unilateral domination that that the world experienced in the 1990s. That's the thinking in Moscow. That's the thinking in Beijing. That's the thinking elsewhere. We can't let the Americans tell us what's right and wrong and how the world really is.
Well, I'd like to see how that translates into social media, YouTube, Facebook, and other vehicles as well.
And that's one thing that's fascinating. You take the media model and you atomize it down to individual consumers and individual meme makers, and it becomes chaotic, right? And it's not every country has its own media apparatus. It's Five Guys can contest the established narrative, and if the memes are dank, then the crowds will follow.
Right.
But it's, at least in statecraft, there are certain material constraints that come from having to run an economy and having to feed an army that force you to acknowledge some baseline reality. While if you're Five Guys on a podcast or Breitbart News or any other of these hyper decentralized sources, you can say whatever you want, right? The story is free, it's liberated, which is great until your people storm the Capitol and nobody knows what to do.
Gotcha.
Sorry about that. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. I had some crazy fucking audio issues. We didn't get into Navalny.
Yeah, no.
This was really supposed to be a conversation about Navalny, who he is, why some people are making him more than he really is. Why is he a thorn in Putin's side, if he's really a thorn in Putin's side? And there's so much more about, Russia in the geopolitical space. Russia and China. What does that mean? What is what is the strategic relationship between Russia and China mean? What are the ramifications of the new Cold War with a Biden administration? There's a lot of directions that we can go here.
Ukraine, Middle East.
Ukraine, the Middle East, petrodiplomacy. How is Russia trying to position itself in the land of oil, the world of oil, obsolescence? How does it maintain its position in the hierarchy? Russia and Syria. So what's the basis of the Russian affection for the Syrian regime? And is that how far is Russia willing to go to protect that relationship? Is Biden going to be interested to possibly reconfigure military action there to topple the Assad regime? I mean, there is the liberal flank of capital in America. The Democrats have staked out the argument that Putin is the boogeyman in the world today,
and that they're trying to pin Trump and the rise of right-wing nationalism in Europe on Putin as well.
On Putin as well, I think incorrectly. I'm not saying that. Listen, you were trying to.
You're saying Rachel Maddow's been lying to me?
She's been lying to herself.
I'm gonna stop messing with you.
And you're just part of the audience for that.
And so, there are so many questions that can be asked because to me, these are the major geostrategic factors that need to be assessed in terms of what are we going to be doing with this new administration. I think it's a very important question to ask. Is Putin's aversion to NATO because of the historical treatment of Russia in the post-Soviet era enough to have him tacitly support reactionary nationalists globally? And if we would say he's willing to support them in Europe, then why is the logical conclusion that he wouldn't have done so with Trump a completely, cartoonist suggestion to make? And that's something that I also ask some on the left who will say, well, Russiagate is nonsense. Well, you say Russiagate is nonsense, but you're saying that Putin is playing footsie with Viktor Orban and that he likes Marine Le Pen, and so on and so forth. And him and he's pro-Brexit. These are all the logical consequences of these questions. I don't see a lot of people on the left. Maybe they don't have the intellectual heft to challenge or interrogate these issues, because I believe the left in America is profoundly weak on foreign policy, not only just African and the global South, but everywhere. But, I'm not seeing these questions being asked effectively. So, Cuba, I'd like you to chime in and give us your thoughts if you have any.
So I think that the Putin he sees his role as a kind of geopolitical redemptive force for Russia, that he stopped the bleeding of the Yeltsin period and he reestablished the strength of the Russian state, which it's something that Americans may have a lot of trouble empathizing with, but Russia has historically been so insecure, so vulnerable to invasion, with so many traumatic conquests and struggles fought on its own territory, the destruction of its own core, that the protection of territory is absolutely central to the mission of Russian leadership. You're not a good leader unless you can keep the foreigners out, unless you can keep Hitler from burning down, from taking Moscow, unless you can keep Genghis Khan from coming in the other side. So the NATO is a threat, not because of some Cold War leftover antagonism, but because it's a threat. It would be a threat to the Russian Empire. It would be a threat to Ivan the Terrible. And the West is not only NATO, but it's also the NGOs that could potentially sponsor a color revolution to bring back Boris Yeltsin type dissolution that would be advantageous, that would weaken Russia and let the Westerners, let the Americans do what they want. The condition of the global economy, not just in the West, but in Russia as well, is one where a lot of people are suffering. There's a lot of precariousness. Essential services are hard to come by, and the system is visibly rigged. And that's where Navalny gets his mojo. That's where he gets his support. He is a man of great bravery and visible personal integrity, in line with the experiences of many millions of Russians, that is calling out a rigged system. He is a committed, let the law be served, let justice be done, no more cheating, no more corruption. These crooks and thieves have gotten away with it for way too long. They're lying to you and they're taking advantage of you. It's a message that is not that dissimilar from Trump's, except Navalny has a lot more integrity and a lot more credibility when he pushes it. And he can mobilize a base of support in Russia, legitimate, organic base of support, because many people know that what he's saying is true. And this counter-systemic moment is dangerous for elites all around the world. Putin is trying to keep a lid on it, and he's been successful at it. This isn't the first wave of protests. There have been protests before. When he came back to the presidency after being prime minister, there was a national a wave of hundreds of thousands of people in demonstrations all across Russia, and he's weathered it. He's weathered international criticism over Sochi. He's weathered Pussy Riot. He's weathered even the sanctions following the Crimean War, and handled economic downturns. So I don't think he's at risk from Navalny, but I do think that Navalny is he's at the head of a real grievance among the Russian people.
And Pussy Riot is a punk band from Russia. It wasn't an actual riot.
It wasn't an actual riot. It could be both. It could be both.
So you're saying Navalny is not a color revolution character. He's not a CIA cutout.
He's not a Saakashvili. He's not
he's not Saakashvili. Okay.
Yeah, he's not an asset. He's not a crony. He's not a Davos guy. He's like, imagine if Ralph Nader
if Ralph Nader started a revolution in the Green Party and started
exactly.
Can I ask you a Ralph Nader question real quick? Maybe you know the answer to this, maybe you don't. There's all this Ralph Nader was on somebody's show recently. I couldn't tell you who it was, and I honestly don't care to even remember. But I like seatbelts, so I always have a soft spot in my heart for Ralph Nader. And he said that the squad won't talk to him. And I was like, I don't think anybody in Congress really fucks with Ralph Nader. Is he kind of a dude that people stay away from?
I mean, people still believe that they can blame the 2000 election on Ralph Nader. Blame the 250,000 Democrats who voted for George W. Bush before you blame Ralph Nader. It doesn't even make sense.
I agree with that, yeah.
But also, why would you talk to Ralph Nader, right? Like, what's
Ralph Nader? Ralph Nader has done some services.
No, I'm saying as a Congress person, because Ralph Nader's point is not like, why would?
Yeah, Ralph Nader is not trying to use electoral politics as the main vehicle to empower any kind of left. He's in third partyism or outside agitation or protest. But I mean,
But he was making it sound like they don't want to listen to anything he's got to say. And I'm kind of with Kuba on that. Like, what? They're not trying to talk to Ralph Nader at this point. Sorry, Ralph.
Diana Gwynn thinks Navalny is a CIA Mossad intelligence asset, pink Pussy Riot type, or because Chomsky. She said because Chomsky likes him.
Chomsky likes Navalny.
I'm not surprised that Chomsky likes Navalny.
Chomsky likes Navalny. Is this
Chomsky
real?
Putin.
Chomsky likes Putin,
He hates Putin. He's not a fan of Putin at all.
but Chomsky likes Navalny. Kuba, you're the man inside.
There's a great article. There's a great piece that came out recently about Navalny, and it starts out with, "It's impossible not to admire somebody who shows bravery, personal courage, and integrity. But that, just because of that doesn't mean they agree with your politics." And there's a lot to like about Navalny because he's a guy who's pretty ballsy. He stands up to Putin. He got poisoned and he got onto a plane and he flew right back. So it's possible to like certain aspects about him, but he also is kind of racist against Caucasian people, by which I mean people from the actual Caucasus, not the euphemism for
Oh shit! I was about to say, well, can I cast a vote?
Yeah.
So wait, I have been reading about his racism.
I had
I've been
Nancy
reading about
Pelosi today on the floor of Congress mention Navalny's name as some kind of sign that, yeah, and Putin's going down. I was like, what?
What is this? So can we ask?
I mean, she was like projecting all of this on Navalny. And you know, I mean, there's currently a sanctions issue going on in the House that Biden is about to put sanctions on, not Russia, but is it Burma? What country starts with a B?
Myanmar.
Myanmar.
Burma, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And they're all getting excited about these sanctions and whatnot. And I'm like, you know, again, like the need to find some reason to make Putipute
Either one of you follow Burma at all? What's going on over there with even a little bit? Have you followed it?
Yes.
Peripherally? So you know that woman, I believe she won. Sushi won a Nobel Prize, correct?
Yes.
And then she was part of the Rohingya genocide.
I mean, I don't
genocide adjacent.
No, I'm not. Like, it's definitely ethnic cleansing, right? But that's not where I was going. It really felt like it wasn't state led. She didn't push it. She didn't even let it happen. It was organized. It was like it was volunteerism.
But she was working with the military, right? I'm sorry for cutting you off, Kuba. I wasn't trying to, but she was working with the military that was all about killing these people, because her father was like the head of the military at one point in time, and she said, these were all my brothers because my father was the head of the military, and I'm going to work with them, and we're not going to do horrible shit. And then horrible shit just keeps getting done. And was it 1 million displaced Rohingya?
Yes. Well, the Rohingya,
I'm overly simplifying it too.
It's the military are the ones who couped her, right? They're the ones who removed her from power. And she's been a problem for them, right? Because they were running the show perfectly happily, but as a democracy activist, she, like Navalny, actually very similar to Navalny, she was somebody who believes in principles, believes in the rules, sticks to the rules, doesn't like these military guys pushing regular Burmese around, doesn't like them taking all the money and the resources. The system should be fair. We should have elections. And did the West started paying attention. They gave her a Nobel Prize, and the military has a problem now.
But she doesn't like Muslims, right?
None of them do. There's a consensus. The Burmese are largely Buddhist, or they follow traditional religions.
Long-term historical beef between the Buddhists and the Muslims in Asia.
It's actually a lot more recent, and you can blame it on the British, because it just comes down.
Well, I mean, long term, like it's been a while. It goes back to.
Why would you say blame it on the British, Kuba? Sorry.
The Rohingya are a group that's actually from Bangladesh, and during the Raj, the British moved large populations of Rohingya into modern Burma in order to serve as a labor source. And they displaced locals, but now they are locals because that was 150 years ago. It's your granddaddy's time, but your neighbor remembers how it was his granddaddy's land, and why are there so many of you, and why do I have to care about Islam? This is Burma. And you have that kind of nativist reaction to the Rohingya, a refusal to accept that they're legitimately Burmese. And the ethnic cleansing, it's a little like Serbia, where there's enough of it in this culture and the society, so you don't need a political instigator. It'll start happening, and the role of a responsible leader is to make it stop, which Aung San Suu Kyi failed to do. But she wasn't the architect of the ethnic cleansing. That's the only point I'm trying to make. Yeah.
So did we answer you guys?
And now there's sanctions on Burma.
What about Burma? You like Mission Burma?
Right.
There's sanctions on Burma. One last question I want to ask, because we usually try to run an hour and a half. We're definitely going long. So Kuba, if you have to go, I understand.
I appreciate. I mean, this is a real delight. It's a pleasure. But
are you enjoying this? Are you enjoying this?
Yeah. if you're like, I'd get me the fuck out of here. No, you're fine. Is everybody watching the chat fine? Can we go a little bit longer? Because there's a few more questions that I think I want to ask, and I definitely want to get to you guys' questions. So let us know if we're going too long, and then we'll cut it. Sanctions. So we had to get the fascist out of office, because if we didn't get the fascist out of office, then the world was going to come to some sort of end, or he was going to blow everybody up. Something bad was going to happen. So deportations have been happening in the hundreds still with the Biden administration, regardless of these very, very titular executive orders. We won't even get into checks. Let's just keep it on a strictly foreign policy, right? So our immigration policy is still have some issues, right? And these sanctions haven't stopped, if not gotten a bit worse, because if the issue was we just went ahead and appointed a leader in Venezuela with Juan Guaido, the new Biden administration has said Juan Guaido is our leader of Venezuela. We're having issues now with Burma. Definitely still issues with Russia and China. So what has fundamentally changed? Kuba, what are we building back better?
So the Trump did have a serious impact on some of the foreign policy consensus, and he basically ended the age of everybody agreeing that free trade, the more the merrier, the more liberal the international economy, the better. And the attitude in Washington has definitely hardened around a confrontational attitude towards Beijing. The attitude in Beijing has also hardened around a confrontational attitude towards Washington. So it's a bit of a chicken.
Understandable.
Like Beijing is not innocent in this, right? But it's important to point that out, right? Like just because Washington may be unreasonable doesn't mean that Beijing they're the good guys. I think that Iran, the deal might not happen. That already you have more hawkish types being appointed to the National Security Council and other advisory positions. So Trump may have killed the Iran deal. There's a very strong constituency in Washington for being tough on Iran no matter what. And it's bipartisan. There's Democrats and there's Republicans that can agree on one thing, which is Iran needs to be in a box, and we need to do whatever we can to apply maximum pressure. They're relieved that Trump got them out of what was a very popular and effective anti-proliferation program. So the only things that the only kind of obvious places where there would be improvement are West-West relations, specifically like transatlanticism, EU, Canada, the potentially Japan, Korea, sort of shoring up relationships with traditional allies, and potentially climate change, reaching some kind of international agreement, maybe West only, maybe you can get China on it, because they're actually pretty enlightened when it comes to climate. They know that they're going to be badly hit if
he stopped the drilling in the Antarctic, right? I think that was one thing that the Biden administration did do, right? Stop any kind of drilling projects in the Antarctica.
I know that the Trump wanted to open up the ANWR, the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge, to drilling, and he was even selling the rights, but Big Oil saw that he was a lame duck and nobody bought them. So
I thought that there was some sort of executive order, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe that's the. I think
he killed. I think it's ANWR. I think it's I remember which is all the way. It goes all the way back to Bush days. Dick Cheney wanted to drill there. You can't drill in Antarctica yet because
he said yet.
Melted. Yeah, give it time. Give it time. Right? Like, call me an optimist. Right?
I want to ask you a question. Mm-hmm. And let me know if you disagree with this framing. I'd like to hear your thoughts. There was a time in which those who worked within the orbit of the Trump administration, particularly those like Steve Bannon, tried to frame Trump's rise as this kind of dialectic between the nationalists and the globalists. Now, I have some comrades of mine who hate the term globalists because they're like, capital is global anyway, it always has been, and using that as a means of framing just simply plays into a kind of limited analysis. But I think we all know here what Bannon was referring to when he said globalist. He's talking about the Davos, what he would call the party of Davos, the NATO, the World Economic Forum, the IMF, the World Health Organization, et cetera, et cetera. The liberal democratic order that held consensus after World War II, that was created largely in the kind of Bretton Woods kind of fashion with the U.S. and the West to maintain a certain kind of Anglo-American hegemony, if you will. The alphabet roundtable groups, et cetera, et cetera. And Bannon basically, what the Trumpists tried to portray is that they were in opposition to these forces. And there was a time where I think even some on the left, during Trump's administration, being that Trump was the latest in the constellation of reactionary nationalists, you had Orban, you have Bolsonaro, you have the guy in UKIP with Brexit, Nigel Farage, you have Boris Johnson, you have Marine Le Pen in France, you have the Five League. Trump is actually a late manifestation of a global trend of reactionary nationalists, largely reacting to immigration, economic precarity, austerity, so on and so forth. One, my question to you is, do you believe the analysis that during the age of Trump that we were stuck in a dialectical between the globalists and the reactionary nationalists? And two, if you believe that there is this phenomenon of globalists using the measuring stick that I did, is Biden really trying to do anything but simply reconfigure politics on their terms? Is that basically what it's about? I'd like to hear your thoughts. I'm really interested in what you think.
So the term globalist comes with a lot of baggage.
Yes, it does.
there, and so I'm reluctant to endorse that framing. At the same time, descriptively, it's not right, but it's not wrong. There definitely are institutions, individuals, powerful interests that are motivated and actively working to further what they call globalization. Easier trade flows, easier flows of finance, money, potentially, it's debatable whether you want to include labor in that. Some do, some don't. Most don't. And transformation of institutions along the lines of the Washington Consensus, right? It was an agenda, absolutely, and like you said, an Anglo-American agenda designed. And I think that within the proponents of globalization, you had a number of different tendencies. There were some who liked globalization because they saw it as a vehicle for Anglo-American hegemony. There are some who like globalization because they saw it as a ladder out of nationalism. That's how we were going to create the universal man. That's how we were going to break down national barriers. That's how we were going to get the multiracial, multi-ethnic, inclusive, feminists, global elite all working together. Capitalists of all countries unite. And so that's real. I don't know if, and Joe Biden certainly over the course of his career has been a proponent of globalization, or liberal internationalism, and he, but I think that he was like a American power globalizer rather than a, post-national globalizer. And I think that that coalition between those who see globalization and international integration as a national program that advances their particular economic, their particular national interests, versus those who see it as a blueprint for the future, right? The Jetsons, the Star Trek, whatever, like the New World Order. I think that alliance may be breaking down. I think that we're not going to go back to the age of greater and greater economic integration internationally, because the national greatness globalizers are backing away from it. And however, culturally, and there's this really interesting pivot that when you can't salvage your program on an economic basis, when you can't, pretend to be a progressive because of what you're doing to working people, you can pretend to be a progressive by your cultural program. So, and what UKIP and a lot of these right-wing nationalists, what they most successfully mobilize against is gay weddings, or, they're ramming political correctness down our throat, this kind of thing, or immigration. That's an enormous bugbear with real identitarian rather than economic overtones. So there are nationalists. There's also, definitely the other side of that equation. Steve Bannon has people, that has legs. And there's also an unstable alliance there between, kind of like national sovereignty, social democrats or Christian Democrats that maybe don't have the same reactionary cultural agenda, but don't like globalization, like all of the left-wing Brexiteers. So I think that that's a very significant cleavage. And there was a moment in which it was super salient. That may have been what ultimately the proximate cause of the end of neoliberalism. That's the rock that neoliberalism sank on. But going forward, I don't think that those lines are going to hold, because Biden can't, it's not 1996 anymore. The world has changed.
That was very sad the way you ended that, because I'm still reading that Joe Biden book, and yeah, I feel like he's governing like it's 1996.
In Washington D.C., it's always 1996.
Oh no, that's a good or bad thing.
Right, like America's always the global leader. The international community is always waiting for Washington to take the lead, and our best days are.
The West Wing is always on TV.
Oh God,
Exactly, exactly. You nailed it.
Well, I'd like to have you back.
It's not holding. She's not taking it. She said, "I'd rather have some autonomy and some democracy with a nationalist than be sold to the highest bidder with a neoliberal globalist agenda. This agenda is totalitarian and anti-human." Wow.
I mean, have you met humans? Is that really such a bad thing?
Wow, that's terrible.
Yeah, like it's a issue that resonates, right? The problem is that
I don't find either of the two options preferable.
Yeah, the problem is the nationalists are lying to you, right? Like, you're not going to have autonomy. You're not going to have it. Maybe some of them will have autonomy over you, but you're just like with Brexit. England has gained nothing and lost tremendously.
Oh my God.
It'll still have to follow most of the rules that Brussels issues, but now it has no say in Brussels.
Yep.
So I think that in some ways, there's no putting the genie back in the bottle, because when you have international supply chains and international markets, that's just how economies operate. And on the flip side of it, is it really better to be bullied by Washington than Brussels? You know, better to be harassed by Westminster than the Tories in Westminster than the Eurocrats in Belgium. Unless you're going to radically decenter administration, then you're just handing power from one group of elites that don't like you to another group of elites that probably like you even less.
You know, you're making the argument that the anarchists make, is that's why we need to have decentralized workers' cooperatives and get all the elites out of power and have all.
I think that there's no way to get around the elite problem with a modern economy, especially if you're going to have a technological fix to to climate change instead of a starvation fix to climate change. You're going to need some bureaucrats. You're going to need some administration, some coordination. The key is finding mechanisms to maintain a connection between the people who are doing the administering and the people that they're making decisions for. That's why small countries can have responsive bureaucracies. A place like Singapore, a place like Iceland, even Germany has managed to maintain some link between administration and administered. But you reach a certain size and it becomes very, very challenging. And then the potential for corruption, self-dealing, or even just straight up authoritarian callousness is very dangerous. In some ways, it's kind of good that the European Union isn't too effective, because if it were, then it could, were it not for all the sort of democratic hoops that it has to jump through before it does anything, then it could do too much.
Diana Gwynn you're contradicting yourself.
Francis Madsen, shout out to Francis. Would like to know, can Kuba please say something about what attracted him to working in the defense industry in the first place, or is that for another time?
I kind of feel like maybe that could be the last question, or we should call it, and then if you'll have me back, I will allow myself to be invited.
We're going to have you back.
Well, then we'll save that question for
Kuba's
return. Fireside chats.
Because
Excellent.
because there's too many questions to ask. You
Dude,
might
this is-
become our default Western foreign policy guest. Quite actually,
Are you okay?
we're looking. Are you? Now we have to ask, how good is your global South, Africa policy, AFRICOM? How good are you on those issues? Or are you more of a Europe guy?
I spent 2 years teaching at the Diplomatic Academy in Hanoi, Vietnam. So I'm pretty good. I'm strong on Asia. I was in the Middle East working for the Department of Defense. I'm good on the Middle East. Latin America.
Now understand, just because we have you on, we do understand that you have left politics. You have worked for the Department of Defense, so we may bring on a more radical left voice to counter yours, to integrate,
but not like a debate type thing, because that's for other people.
All we need is more left-on-left violence.
Yeah,
I'm just saying.
This is the left-on-left violence safe zone. The community, as you can see, is very interested in the conversation community. We don't try to incite anger, and I'm not yelling.
I'm not trying to incite anger. I'm just saying it would be.
Diana Gwynn is gonna, when she sees you, she's gonna cut you.
It's funny, and in Berkeley, in the political science department, I was definitely an outlier on the left. But then I started hanging out with sociologists, and all of a sudden, I was the right wing in any conversation. So I'm more than happy to talk to share our ideas and to discuss with anyone, including people who might think that I'm a bit of a sellout because of what I've done in my career, and I've got a thick skin and open mind.
You see the movie SLC Punk?
Yes.
Maybe that's what it always ends up
being. Listen, Cuba. Listen, we're not trying to peg you in any way here. We want you're honest. We find value in your contribution here. Like I said, you came from the dark side. You left empire. You have left-like politics. You have critiques of empire, but we'd like to talk to you about how empire works and what's going on with the empire. And there's some value to having a former insider talk to you about how the empire views itself.
Maybe that's what we should call this whole segment, Inside the Empire.
That's not bad.
We have if J. Andrew World is watching, we have J. Andrew World draw a picture of Kuba in like the Empire uniform, not the stormtrooper, but the uniform of like the
like an imperial bureaucrat, right? Like
and he's just telling secrets from inside.
You wouldn't believe what Darth Vader puts in his coffee.
I was thinking when you were talking, I was thinking at one point, I was like, what were those meetings like? What were those closed door meetings like where Kuba's hearing all this fucking neocon hawkish bullshit, and they look over at his ass and they go, so what do you think? Whatever you guys say sounds fine to me.
The military guys are not. One thing I'll point out is that generally speaking, the Department of Defense people are relatively even keeled, right? They're not going to agree with you politically, but they have a problem solving approach because they're the ones who are going to have to do something. The real crazy you hear from the think tank people.
Rand Corporation types?
Cato, AI, others, even the sort of like Brookings, the mainstream ones, the ones that show up on CNN and MSNBC. There's sensible people there, but they have more than their share of crazy too, and that's when I gotta like bite my tongue, and they're the ones who, yeah, like, so what do you think, comrade?
And you're like,
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
Herbert said was fine. Those kids don't need
Exactly.
clean drinking water.
I'll take a pass on this one. But yeah, it's I'm anytime you'd like, I'd be very happy to be back.
Well, we are going to definitely hold you to that. We've gone 2 hours, which is
We didn't
definitely
even fully interrogate our initial subject.
Navalny or contemporary Russian politics. We got
this is a target rich environment.
the thing is that I'm gonna say it. We have a good chat community. And I like when the chat community gets sassy. I like when the chat community has good questions. And I feel like they had really good questions today that kind of shifted our conversation a little bit more than maybe we had questions scheduled for. If you guys could see the questions that we were asking Kuba originally, I could have posted that, and I think people would have been pretty stoked at his answers that he was giving back in our back and forth conversations that we were having before this show. So much so, no, Gene, he's not going to bed. He's on the same time zone as me. That motherfucker's wide awake. He's just drank 2 cans of Coke. If anything, he's probably got to pee.
Yeah, but we all have our sacrifices to make, right? But yeah, like this has been a real pleasure, and I could see the chat too. You got like some very good reactions here. Some of the questions that were coming out of the chat too. Great material.
So
Like to have
we'd like to have you back. We're gonna end this show today. You guys probably don't care to hear it. I don't give a shit. I'm gonna play it anyway. My show. I got accidentally asked by NPR in Boston to be interviewed. I got a message. If you listen to the podcast, like the one I just did with Jean Bajlan, I record an introduction before the actual show you hear, which is an unedited conversation. And as I'm recording this, I get a message. Hey, I'd like to interview you real quick. I'm like, fine. Like, when do you want to do it? He's like, well, can you do it now? I was like, actually, I'm fucking set up. So sure, I'll do it. And as I'm doing the interview, the guy goes, that article you wrote in The Guardian didn't say this. And I was like, I didn't write any article in The Guardian. He goes, well, it says here the host of This Is Revolution podcast is the author of this article in The Guardian. And the article was about Facebook banning the author and Facebook banning leftists. I got banned from Facebook. Pascal and I both got our profiles deleted temporarily. I got my second profile deleted temporarily, and I got my original profile deleted all the way. I'm telling the guy this story. He sends me the Guardian article, and as I read down at the end of the Guardian article, whoever wrote it was an African gentleman, and he says he's the host of This Is the Revolution podcast. And I was like, oh, dude, you know what? You interviewed me, and it's the wrong guy. I'm really sorry. I wasted your time, and if you don't want to use it, that's fine. He goes, oh no, fuck that. It was a great interview. We're fucking gonna roll with it, and it's going live on this day. So today, the interview went live, and it was a show with Shoshana Zuboff, who wrote the book Surveillance Capitalism, which is actually a book I'm a big fan of, and but trying to get her on the show. So they start the show off with my interview. So I'm going to play a little bit of that show as we go out of here, so you can hear me talk about big tech overreach. And I'd actually talked about you in the interview, but they didn't air it, Pascal, because I talked about the fact that you had lost access to your page that you started, Blacks Against Capitalism, for a while. So it was funny. They weren't even looking for me. They got the wrong black guy, but I guess it was the right black guy. So we're gonna go out with that and have a good night, guys.
All right.
Take care. Thank you.
The following message come from MIT's System Design and Management, offering on-campus, hybrid, and distance education for over 20 years. Earn a master's degree in engineering and management. Join a virtual info session on Tuesday, February 9th from noon to 1 p.m. SDM.
That COVID is being
Hello, the information you do see, shaping and twisting and amplifying content that does not educate, but instead just titillates and manipulates. So in a world where information is king, what are these powerful kings of information doing to the world's democracies? Well, that's the question we're going to explore today, and we're going to start with someone who got deplatformed. He is not a president or a conspiracy theorist. He's a Californian named Jason Miles, who posted an essay onto Facebook on January 12th.
It started from me going to a grocery store right outside of where I live in Oakland, California, and seeing a homeless man. I've worked and lived amongst the unhoused community for several years, and kind of the way everybody treated him during this pandemic, and looking at just how it's very, very transparent how we treat poor people across the board. And we're seeing real-time redlining with the way that COVID is being contained in certain areas. And that's all I wrote. The next day, I couldn't log in.
Miles is a musician and host of the This Is Revolution podcast. His Facebook essay talked about Lisa Montgomery, the convicted killer who was the first woman executed by the federal government since 1953. And the essay's title draws from the dead Kennedy's song, Kill the Poor. So it was Jason Miles' analysis, his opinion. He didn't think there was anything in the essay that would have violated Facebook's terms of service.
It wasn't anything about seizing any means of production. I'm not trying to incite any riots. It definitely wasn't an angry piece. So I'm in a car dropping off my son at this point on a cell phone. So I'm like, I'll wait till I get home. I get home, profile's deleted. Gone. Pictures I had for years, tour videos, anything that was in my personal profile, totally deleted and never returning, apparently. There was no like, this is down for X amount of days, this is why we did it. No rhyme or reason. I just posted this essay and got deleted.
Facebook gave him a link to appeal the decision. Miles says it didn't work.
Luckily, I was in a group with my ex for years, and she used our band account as her personal account for a long time. And so I had access to it as well, and I never really used it. So it was like a dormant thing that I had for this band that didn't really exist anymore. So I was able to just get into that and change the name. And then like 5 days later, that got banned. No explanation, but they banned me for like a week on that. And then I got my account back. Really, it didn't make any sense. And I thought, what did I do? What did I say to cause this to happen? You're going into panic mode at first. Like, okay, I got to get access to my page again. I got to get access to this again. I had some fail safes set up so I could get access to the page again with a new account, thank goodness. And I didn't really have time to think about what happened until I wanted to post something and I was scared. And it wasn't anything crazy. It was just the fear of, what am I saying that's triggering the algorithm? Because I don't think I'm saying that much when I post. I'm not the incite the riot guy. I'm not the angry, funny guy. I'm not the talk crap about you to get attention guy. That's not my thing. So I don't know what I would have done to set off some sort of alarm. And I think that's the real scary part about this. The first time I was upset because, those are pictures that I had of my grandmother who I lived with for years that I miss dearly to this day. I lost pictures of her. I lost pictures of my older children. when they were little that I took with old phones that I don't have anymore, right? So that's frustrating because it feels like a time in your life is gone. And then to have it happen a second time was beyond frustrating because it's like, okay, you start to self-censor, and the biggest censorship is the censorship you put on yourself. The power of social media, the power of these tech companies is massive, and we have to address it.
It's Jason Miles. He's lead singer and guitarist on the band Bitter Lake and host of the This Is Revolution podcast. Well, let's turn now to Shoshana Zuboff. She's a professor emerita at Harvard.